The day my marriage ended, I was holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold while I watched my wife's face do something I'd never allowed myself to see before. I told her we were selling the house and moving to a trailer park, and the woman I'd given 10 years of my life to looked at me like I was something she'd tracked in on the bottom of her shoe and informed me with the cold clarity of someone who had been waiting a long time to say exactly this, that she would have no trouble finding herself a real man. My name is Frank Calloway. I grew up in Macon, Georgia, son of a Kenworth driver and a woman who pressed other people's shirts at a dry cleaner on Mulberry Street 6 days a week. We weren't rich by any definition, but we weren't lacking for anything that actually mattered. My father communicated in short sentences that worked like good hand tools. You picked them up, you used them, and they held up over time. The most useful thing he ever told me came when I was 14, sulking over some perceived injustice at school, looking for sympathy at the dinner table. He looked up from his pot roast and told me plainly that nobody owed me anything, and that the sooner I understood that, the sooner I could get to work. Then he went back to eating. I sat with those words for about a year before I really understood them. Once I did, they became the bedrock of everything I built afterward. I started swinging hammers at 19 for a residential contractor named Herb Dooley out of Warner Robins, loud, profane, and possessed of a near supernatural gift for walking a property and knowing its cost within 2% before a single nail was driven. Herb taught me more about construction in 3 years than most men learn in a decade. But the most important thing he ever told me had nothing to do with framing or foundations. We were standing on a completed project one afternoon, watching a young family walk through a house I'd helped build, the wife running her hand along the kitchen cabinets with the expression of a woman claiming something. And Herb said quietly that the man who builds the house makes money once, but the man who owns the land makes money forever. I wrote it in a small notebook I kept in the pocket of my Carhartt jacket. I never threw that notebook away. By 27, I had my contractor's license and $31,000 saved from 5 years of 60-hour weeks and sandwiches eaten out of a cooler, and I bought my first lot, a quarter-acre infill parcel on the south side of Macon that most investors had dismissed. I'd done my homework on the city's rezoning plans, the infrastructure corridor they were building, the school redistricting coming through. I paid $22,000 for the lot, built a 3-bedroom house on it with my own hands in a crew of 2, and sold it for $112,000. The profit mattered less than the education. I understood then that real estate is not about buildings. It's about reading where things are going before anyone else is looking in that direction. I did it again and again. Callaway Development, LLC came into existence in 1994 as a sole proprietorship with a post office box and one ongoing project. By the time I was 46, it had 12 employees, 14 completed residential projects across 4 Georgia counties, commercial holdings generating steady passive income, and a relationship with my regional bank that was worth more than any individual asset on the balance sheet. My banker once told me that in 22 years of lending, he had never once had to call me about a late payment. I considered that the finest professional review I'd ever received. I also had a best friend named Roy Hendricks, who had been my framing contractor, my hunting partner, and the closest thing to a brother I'd ever had for 30 years. Roy is built like a barrel and laughs like a barn door in a windstorm, and has been married to his wife Dorothy for 34 years in the loud, fierce, entirely genuine way of people who chose each other correctly the first time. Every Sunday afternoon I spent at their kitchen table eating Dorothy's cooking and watching football with Roy. I came away with a renewed sense of what a real partnership between 2 people actually looked like from the inside. Roy never trusted Diane, not from the first handshake. He told me once, about a year into the marriage, that she seemed like someone who was always keeping score. I told him that was just how she engaged with the world. He gave me the steady, brown-eyed look of a man who has said what needed saying and understands the other man isn't ready to hear it, and we went back to talking about a framing project we were running together in Bibb County. I filed his warning under things I didn't want to examine and closed the drawer on it. I met Diane at a real estate industry mixer in Macon in the spring of 2013. I was 46, she was 31, auburn hair past her shoulders, green eyes with something behind them that could have been warmth or could have been calculation depending on the light, and your willingness to look carefully. She was the most attractive person in the room, and she had chosen to talk to me, which, if I'd been applying the same analytical rigor I applied to land acquisition decisions, should have stopped me cold. I was not anyone's idea of a romantic lead. I was 50 pounds heavier than I'd been at 30, more salt than pepper in my hair, and my idea of a perfect evening involved the ribeye at Fincher's barbecue and an early bedtime. The fact that a 31-year-old woman who could have been talking to any man in that room had chosen to direct the full beam of her attention at me, that was a data point I consciously chose not to process. She asked what I loved about the work, not what I did, not the revenue numbers, not the market outlook, what I loved about it. I told her the truth, the permanence, that I could drive through middle Georgia and point at things that wouldn't exist if I hadn't existed. She listened the way people listen when they've discovered something they didn't expect to find, and somewhere in that conversation I let down a guard I'd been maintaining, mostly successfully, for 20 years of adult life. She was working as a buyer's agent for a boutique Atlanta firm, originally from Savannah, had worked her way into real estate from a secretarial position through what she described as sheer stubbornness. She wanted eventually to open her own firm. The portrait she painted was of a woman who had built her own foundation with her own hands, who valued solidity over flash, who had grown up surrounded by financial instability and was permanently done with it. It was a portrait painted in the exact colors most likely to appeal to a man like me. I believed every brushstroke because I wanted to believe it, and wanting to believe something is the most efficient route to believing it that I know of. We dated a year and a half. I had a prenuptial agreement drafted, reviewed, ready to present. And then I folded it and put it in a filing cabinet because presenting it felt like saying I didn't fully trust her. And I'd convinced myself I'd done my due diligence, that my judgment of character was sound, that the love between us was real. I married Diane Porter at First United Methodist in Warner Robins in April of 2015 with Arroyo as my best man and Dorothy crying quietly in the front pew, and 40 people who mattered to me watching, and I felt genuinely, without performance, like I was beginning the best chapter of my life. That folded prenup sat in that filing cabinet for 7 years. It was the most expensive piece of paper I never used. She quit her Atlanta job within 6 months of the wedding, which I supported without hesitation. Building a local client base takes time, and I was in a position to carry us financially while she established herself. She made some genuine effort for the first year, got her Georgia license, attended brokerage meetings, met with potential clients. I reviewed her business plan and thought it was reasonable. But sustained effort requires a tolerance for the long, uncomfortable period between planting and harvest. And by the spring of 2017, the effort had quietly evaporated. The license stayed active. The clients disappeared. The days filled instead with the house, which she decorated and redecorated with real skill and considerable expense, a yoga studio membership at $400 a month, and a social circle composed with the deliberate selectivity of someone building a financial portfolio rather than genuine friendships. There was a woman on our street named Becky Marsh, a labor and delivery nurse whose husband taught 10th grade history at the local high school. Becky was the kind of person who showed up when you were sick and didn't keep accounts of her generosity. She made multiple genuine efforts to befriend Diane in our first year at Millbrook Estates, and Diane received each of them with a calibrated pleasantness that allowed no real entry, welcoming enough on the surface, closed at the core. Becky understood the dynamic quickly and redirected her warmth elsewhere. I noticed this. I told myself Diane was selective about friendships, and there was nothing wrong with that. What I didn't ask myself was why a woman who claimed to value authenticity would so consistently keep her distance from the most authentically warm person within 3 blocks. I think about Becky Marsh more than I think about Diane, honestly. She told me something true about my marriage simply by being herself and being kept outside it. We traveled. Hilton Head 4 times, Cabo twice, New York a dozen long weekends, Italy for 2 full weeks on our 3rd anniversary. That Italy trip cost $43,000 once you added the flights, the hotel in Florence, the cooking class she wanted in Tuscany, the car service to Amalfi. I told myself she deserved nice things. What I didn't tell myself, what I actively avoided examining, was that her emotional temperature tracked my financial news more reliably than it tracked anything else about me. When a deal closed strong, an appraisal came in above expectation, or a project hit a milestone, she was warm and engaged and present in the way of a woman who is genuinely glad to be exactly where she is. When I came home carrying the weight of a permit delay or a cost overrun or the ordinary friction of a complex business, something cooled. Not dramatically, not in any way that produced a specific conversation or a conflict. Just a degree or two of distance that was distinct from the warmth of the good news evenings. I filed it under her, picking up on my stress every single time, and I closed that drawer every single time, and I am not proud of the consistency with which I managed that particular act of self-deception. The spring of 2019 is when the drawer stopped closing. I had been quietly negotiating the acquisition of a 63-acre parcel in Henry County for the better part of 2 years. The property was called Shady Pines, a mobile home community with 90 trailer units, month-to-month leases, and an owner named Gerald Pitts, who was 74 years old, had been running the place since his father left it to him, and was thoroughly done with the business of running anything at all. His asking price was $1.2 million. I was working toward $1.05 million. The land itself, positioned 3 miles from a growing interstate interchange and 2 miles from a hospital complex that had broken ground 18 months prior, sitting inside the fastest growing residential corridor in the state, was worth 4 to 5 times purchase price once you remove the trailers and develop properly. I had done this math 17 different ways on 17 different yellow legal pads over 2 years, and every version of the calculation came out the same. One evening, I was at my desk working through the financing gap when Diane came in and sat in the leather client chair across from me. She asked what I was working on. I gave her the broad strokes, a significant land acquisition, working through the capital structure. She asked the acquisition price. And then she asked, in the casual conversational tone of a wife making small talk, whether that figure included what was in our joint savings account. We had a joint savings account with approximately $80,000 in it. We had never used it for business purposes. That had been an explicit and agreed upon boundary from the beginning of our marriage. I answered her. She kissed me on the forehead with the mechanical affection I had noticed some months before, without fully acknowledging what I was noticing, and left the room. I lay in the dark that night, turning that question over for a long time. Why that account specifically? Why that particular question, framed that particular way? Was she checking whether I was paying attention to the balance? Testing whether I had noticed something? I put it in the probably nothing drawer, but this time the drawer didn't quite latch shut. 3 weeks later, the mail brought an American Express statement I had never seen. Her name only. Balance $14,322. I went through the line items slowly at the kitchen table with the particular stillness of a man confirming something he has already half arrived at on his own. There was a charge of $3,800 at the Grand Bohemian Hotel in Atlanta's Buckhead neighborhood, covering a Thursday through Saturday in February. The same weekend, Diane had told me she was visiting her college roommate in Marietta. A $900 charge at a restaurant I didn't recognize. $1,200 at a Buckhead jewelry store we had never visited together. And a recurring monthly charge of $295 listed simply as PF Premier, which I didn't recognize, but which, when I looked it up that evening, turned out to be a premium subscription tier for a platform built specifically for people who needed to conduct their private lives away from ordinary social media. The kind of platform that doesn't appear on a shared device and doesn't send notifications that a spouse might see. I sat with that statement until I heard the sound of the Escalade in the driveway. By the time Diane walked through the door, I had it back in the stack of mail, fresh coffee in my hand, and an expression on my face of complete Saturday morning ordinariness. Something shifted inside me in that moment into a register I had never quite used before. Not rage. Rage is hot, and I was cold. Not grief, not yet. Something more clinical. The same faculty I used when walking a potential acquisition and reading everything wrong with it before making any decision. I was going to read this situation completely and carefully before I made a single move. I requested itemized phone records for both lines on our account going back 12 months. Any account holder can do this, though most people never think to. The records arrived by email 4 days later. I reviewed them in my truck in the parking lot of a Chick-fil-A on Watson Boulevard on a Wednesday lunch hour because I did not want to be sitting at my desk or anywhere in that house when I read them. There was a number appearing in Diane's call and text history 3 to 4 times every week, with calls ranging from 15 minutes to over an hour. The concentration of this number was heaviest on weekends when I traveled for work, site visits, land negotiations, investor meetings in Atlanta and Charlotte. The Marietta weekend showed 22 texts to this number and one call lasting 47 minutes. The week of our 4th anniversary, when I had been in Charlotte for 3 days, showed 31 texts and 2 calls. I sat in that parking lot for 10 minutes while watching a family of 4 get out of a minivan and have an argument about food. Then I finished my coffee, drove back to the office, and that evening called Roy and asked him to recommend a private investigator. Mick Torvalds had been a Houston County Sheriff's deputy for 18 years before going private, recommended through a commercial litigation attorney I'd worked with on a contract dispute. He drove a beige Camry, wore slacks and button-down shirts in subdued colors, and possessed the particular quality of becoming invisible in any context he was placed in. The kind of man who could occupy a parking space across from a Buckhead gym for 4 hours and leave no impression on anyone who'd been there. $250 a day plus documented expenses. I gave him the phone number, the hotel dates, the timeline, and the name on the credit card statement. He told me he expected to have something in 2 to 3 weeks. It took 11 days. He placed a manila envelope on my desk and sat back and let me open it at my own pace. The photographs inside were clear and professionally composed. The man in them, a personal trainer named Brandon, who worked out of a gym in Buckhead, where the Amex card showed 2 recurring charges I now fully understood, looked like no one in particular. 39 years old, built the way someone gets built, who spends 40 hours a week in a weight room, with the easy smile of a man accustomed to being found attractive. He looked like someone who had found a comfortable private arrangement and had been maintaining it without particular guilt. Mick's research showed the relationship had been ongoing for approximately 21 months. The photographs, though, they were not what stopped me cold. It was the financial section of the report. Mick had located a savings account opened at a SunTrust branch in Midtown Atlanta at a bank neither of us had any existing relationship with, held under Diane's maiden name. It contained $68,000. The deposit history showed small transactions executed with metronomic regularity. $50 here, $100 there, $200 occasionally, $500 when the joint account balance had been running high enough that a larger withdrawal was less visible against the overall pattern. 18 months of consistent, methodical accumulation. Not a dramatic theft, a quiet harvest conducted over a year and a half with the patience and discipline of someone who had made a firm decision and was executing on it steadily, without drama, without deviation. 18 months of preparation, which meant that approximately 12 to 15 months after our wedding, while we were still, by every external measure, a couple in the comfortable early days of a shared life, my wife had made a calm, clear-eyed decision that this marriage was temporary, and she had spent the subsequent years performing the marriage with complete professionalism while building the infrastructure of her departure in parallel. I closed the folder. I turned a photograph of us at Hilton Head, face down on my credenza, gently, the way you put something down when you're trying not to break it. Then I picked up the phone and called Bill Garrett, the best family law attorney in Macon, a man Roy's cousin had described as the kind of lawyer you want on your side and spend your whole life hoping never ends up against you. 2 weeks later, going through a filing cabinet in my home office looking for property tax records, legitimate errand, nothing more, I found the notebook in the 3rd drawer beneath a folder of old Georgia power bills. Spiral bound, Diane's handwriting on the cover, no label. I stood at that cabinet listening to the house settle around me. She was at yoga, Wednesday morning, never missed it, and opened it. It was a financial inventory of our marriage, detailed, structured, and periodically updated. Joint account balances, credit card limits, the house's estimated market value with comparable sales she had researched herself, her best estimate of my business holdings based on what she had been able to observe and deduce. The entries were dated, and the earliest went back to the spring of 2017, our second year of marriage. In the back section, she had worked through calculations of what Georgia's equitable distribution law would likely award her in a divorce, with research notes citing specific legal terminology, dissipation of marital assets, separate versus marital property, the equitable distribution standard. That reflected serious, methodical legal research, not a casual browse through a website. Everything written in pencil, in neat, organized rows, in a notebook hidden under utility bills in a drawer she assumed would never be opened by anyone but her. I photographed every relevant page with my phone. I replaced the notebook exactly as I'd found it. I went to the kitchen and made coffee and sat at the table where we had breakfast together every morning and allowed myself 5 full minutes to feel the complete weight of what I had just confirmed. Then I forwarded the photographs to Bill Garrett's office and scheduled a meeting. When we sat down together that Thursday morning, I laid everything on his conference table. The Amex statement, the carrier records with the highlighted call patterns, Mick's full report and photographs, the SunTrust account documentation, the photographs of every page of the notebook. Bill listened to all of it in complete silence. When I finished, he removed his reading glasses, set them carefully on the table, and asked one question: whether there was a prenuptial agreement. There wasn't. He acknowledged that with a single controlled nod, the nod of a man who has heard this exact answer far too many times in this exact room and who has long since learned to keep his personal opinions about it to himself. Then he laid out what we were going to do about it. He explained Georgia's equitable distribution framework, the legal significance of the dissipation evidence, the weight the hidden account in the notebook would carry, the way the LLC structure would be assessed by opposing counsel, and how we needed to be fully prepared to defend it. When he finished the strategic overview, he told me plainly that I needed to maintain completely normal behavior at home. No changes in financial patterns, no separate accounts, nothing that could be construed as premeditated separation before we were ready to file. He needed to know I could do that. I thought about the months I had already spent constructing and maintaining exactly that performance. Every day, at every dinner table, in every ordinary evening conversation that had not been ordinary for a very long time. I told him I had been doing it for a while already. Now let me tell you about the 63 acres, because this is where the story earns the ending it gets. I closed on the Shady Pines acquisition in June of 2019 for $1,050,000, 70% financed through First Southern Regional. The balance from a refinanced loan against a commercial property I'd been holding in Bibb County that had appreciated substantially over several years. On paper, Callaway Development's debt load increased in a way that was visible and meaningful. That was entirely intentional. Gerald Pitts signed the deed on a Thursday morning and shook my hand and said he was glad to be done with all of it. And I drove out to the property that afternoon and stood on 63 acres of Henry County land and felt, with the particular physical certainty that comes from 30 years of reading land, with your feet and your instincts as much as with spreadsheets, that I was standing on something worth many multiples of what I had just paid. The tenants were the first order of business, and they were not an abstraction. 90 families living in temporary structures on month-to-month leases, people with children in local schools, cars parked outside, lives built in the close specific quarters of a mobile home community. I hired a property management firm that specialized in manufactured housing transitions, and we worked through each household individually. Relocation assistance payments ranging from $6,000 to $12,000, depending on circumstance, help identifying and securing the alternative housing, personal connections made where I could make them. 2 families I connected directly with a property owner in Clayton County who had suitable land available. The entire process took 18 months and cost approximately $400,000 when you added the management fees to the individual assistance payments. I considered it the most important investment in the project, and I want to be clear about why. You cannot build something with genuine integrity on the wreckage of people you didn't treat with decency. That is not sentimentality. That is the practical ethics of a man who has to be able to look at what he builds and know the foundation is clean all the way down. By the summer of 2021, the site was cleared and graded, soil studies done, infrastructure engineered and staked. My architect, a sharp young man out of Atlanta named Travis Webb, who had come highly recommended by two other developers I trusted, delivered fully approved and permitted plans for Millbrook Commons, 412 residential units in a mix of townhomes and single-family lots, a community clubhouse with a demonstration kitchen, a resort-style pool and deck, and a trail system connecting to a county greenway the Henry County Parks Department had been quietly developing for 3 years. The development loan for Phase 1, 164 units at a total project budget of $22 million, was secured from a regional construction lender I had cultivated a relationship with over 7 years of progressively larger projects. Diane knew none of it. She knew I owned some land in Henry County. She had never asked what was happening with it. In 5 years of marriage to a real estate developer with an active project portfolio, she had never once asked to see a project site, never once asked to understand a deal structure, never once expressed anything beyond the most surface-level curiosity about the work that funded the entire life we were living. The irony of that, a woman with actual real estate credentials who married a developer and never looked at a single deal, is something I appreciate more clearly now than I did at the time, when I was still too close to see the full pattern. And in December of 2020, through a land broker named Jerome Alderman out of Brunswick, Georgia, who had spent 40 years buying and selling coastal property and knew the Barrier Island market the way I knew Middle Georgia, I acquired 14 acres of private island land off the Georgia coast. One of the lesser-known Barrier Islands, not on any tourist map or real estate listing, accessible only by a 30-minute boat ride from Brunswick. The property had been held by the family of a marine biologist named Charles Brantley since 1971. His widow Adeline was 81 years old, had been paying property taxes on land she couldn't physically reach without a boat, and whose adult children had neither the interest nor the proximity to maintain it. She wanted it to go to someone who would take care of it. I went to see it on a gray November afternoon. Jerome took me out on his bay boat, a 22-foot Carolina skiff, and we tied up at a weathered dock that had seen better decades but was structurally sound where soundness mattered. I walked the property alone for 3 hours. Live oaks, 200 years old with canopies spanning 60 feet, Spanish moss in the November wind, long-leaf pines that had been standing since before the Civil War, a freshwater spring running clear and cold from a source that had apparently never gone dry in recorded memory, a cleared area of 2 acres near the water where a previous structure had stood and gone, the ground still flat and workable. I sat under one of the oaks and ate a sandwich and watched a brown pelican work the water alongside the dock pilings with the absolute unhurried efficiency of a creature that has been doing the same thing in the same place since before there were people to observe it. I stayed for 3 hours and took the boat back at sunset. The next morning, I called Adeline Brantley's attorney and offered $850,000, cash, closing on her schedule. She accepted within 48 hours. The funding came from a combination of sources I had been quietly assembling over 2 years. Proceeds from the Bibb County property refinance, a long-term investment account held under the LLC, and a $200,000 private loan from Roy Hendricks, documented with a proper promissory note at a fair market interest rate, because Roy was a genuine partner in several of my projects, and this was that kind of transaction. The deed went into Callaway Development LLC. The address on the recording was a set of GPS coordinates. I told Diane nothing, not at dinner that evening, not at any dinner afterward. I drove to Brunswick and back in a day and mentioned only that I'd been looking at a coastal land situation that hadn't worked out. I have no pleasure in describing that deception, but I want to be accurate about why it was necessary. By December of 2020, I had mixed report, the carrier records, the Amex documentation, the hidden SunTrust account, and photographs of every page of the notebook. I had been meeting with Bill Garrett for over a year. The divorce was not a contingency I was preparing for. It was a certainty I was carefully sequencing. A Georgia court divides what exists at the time of divorce. The island, structured correctly under the LLC before any filing, was a business asset with clean provenance and clean separation. Because I had spent 30 years building and maintaining a clean wall between my business entity and my personal finances. Never commingling, never using the wrong account, never letting convenience override the discipline of separation. That wall was intact, and the island was protected by it. Bill Garrett told me in one of our planning sessions that the cleanliness of my business structure was worth more to me right now than anything else on the balance sheet. 3 decades of doing it right when it was inconvenient. Maintained when there was no particular reason to be careful. Maintained when no one was watching and no crisis was visible on the horizon. And it all came down to that one sentence from that one man in that one meeting. By the winter of 2022, everything was positioned. Millbrook Commons Phase 1 was in active development, infrastructure complete, foundations going in on the first units, pre-sales event on the calendar. Bill Garrett had the divorce petition drafted, reviewed, and ready to file the morning after I gave him the signal. A young couple named the Gardners, pre-qualified and running against a lease deadline, were standing by for the Millbrook Estates house. The island was waiting. What I needed was a clean legal trigger. I needed Diane to make the move, not me. Her. In Georgia, the conduct of the parties can influence how a court approaches equitable distribution. A spouse demonstrated to have spent marital money sustaining an extramarital relationship is in a materially weaker position. A spouse who initiates the end of the marriage through her own words, in a documentable context, is in a weaker position still. I needed Diane to show me, clearly and on the record, exactly who she was and what this marriage had meant to her. Roy and I worked through it together over bourbon at his kitchen table on a February Tuesday, after Dorothy had cleared the plates from dinner and excused herself with the practiced tact of a woman who has been managing the boundary between her kitchen and men's necessary conversations for 34 years. I told Roy what I was going to do. I was going to tell Diane we were selling the house. I was going to tell her we were moving to the property I owned in Henry County. I was going to describe it as a trailer park, because that was what it was currently designated on paper, and I was going to present it as a decision to live more simply and return to something more honest. Roy turned his glass in his hands for a long time. He said she was going to lose her mind. I said that was more or less the point. He asked what I was actually expecting to hear. I told him the truth. He sat with that for a moment and then told me not to let being a good man make me a slow one. I wrote that down. On Monday, I went home and made dinner, something she genuinely liked, a good bottle of wine, the whole domestic surface maintained at its normal temperature. We ate and talked about things that didn't matter. I watched her across the table with the clear eyes of a man who has done his grieving in private over a long period and come out the other side not hardened, but clarified. She was still beautiful. She was still skilled at warmth and ease and the comfortable rhythms of a shared household. And somewhere underneath the clarity, in the part of me that had loved her for real, because I had, without qualification, loved her for real, there was a low, steady ache, not the sharp pain of a live wound, the ache of mourning something already gone. After dinner, I washed the dishes and looked out at the backyard through the kitchen window. The flagstone patio I'd laid by hand on a summer Saturday in 2017, the hardwood trees I'd planted in the corners of the yard, the outdoor kitchen I'd built along the back fence because she'd wanted one and because I'd seen no reason not to build it properly while I was at it. I dried my hands. I walked to the living room. I sat down next to her on the couch and told her I needed to talk about something. She set down her wine glass and turned toward me with the patient attentiveness I recognized by then as performance, the expression of a wife prepared to engage with whatever her husband needed to discuss, calibrated correctly for the register of a serious conversation. I walked through it slowly, financial concerns, expense patterns, sustainability, thinking carefully about our long-term position. I said we were spending at a level that wasn't building the kind of security I thought we should have. I said I had been thinking about it for a long time. I said I thought we needed to make a serious change. I said I thought we should sell the house. The first flicker of something other than performance appeared at the corners of her eyes. I continued. I told her about Henry County, about Shady Pines, about moving one of the remaining units onto a cleared area I had prepared at the back of the acreage, and living simply for a while and getting back to something more honest in how we were operating. The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. I counted them. In those 4 seconds, I watched my wife's face complete a journey of approximately 10 years in reverse. Every layer of social calibration she had constructed and maintained, the warmth, the approachability, the practiced expression of a woman who is fully present in a partnership, it did not fade or slip. It fell, like a curtain cut from its rigging and all at once. What was underneath was not anger in the familiar hot sense. It was something colder and far more honest. Contempt. Undecorated. Not bothering to be anything other than what it was. She stood up from the couch. The wine glass hit the coffee table hard enough to send a dark stain spreading across the wood toward the folder I had not yet produced. She told me she had not married me to end up in a trailer park. She informed me with the precision of someone finally saying out loud what they had been thinking for years. That she had married me because I was a successful man, because I had built something real, and that what I was currently proposing was not the life she had agreed to, and not the life she intended to live. She said she deserved better. She said she had given up everything for this marriage. Her career, her life in Atlanta, opportunities she had set aside to be here. And she told me, with the final directness of a woman who has decided the performance is over, that finding herself a real man would present no particular difficulty. I sat with all of that for a moment, said nothing, did not argue, did not deflect, did not reach for any of the things a man reaches for when he wants to soften what is happening. I looked at her with the steady attention of someone who has been waiting a long time for a specific thing to be said out loud, and who is not going to interrupt it now that it is finally being said in full. I thought about the Saturday morning with the Amex statement. I thought about the carrier records reviewed in a Chick-fil-A parking lot, the 47-minute call on a weekend she was supposed to be in Marietta. I thought about $68,000 moved $50 at a time with the patience of someone who had already decided on the winner and was stacking firewood for it quietly and steadily. I thought about a spiral notebook in a filing cabinet drawer, penciled calculations dated from the spring of our second year. And I thought about my island, my 200-year-old oaks, my pelicans, my rebuilt dock in November light. I stood up from the couch, walked to the home office, retrieved the manila folder I had placed on my desk 2 weeks prior, and set it on the coffee table next to the spreading wine stain. I told her it was a divorce petition and that my attorney's contact information was on the cover sheet, and that she would want to retain her own representation as soon as possible. She stared at the folder, then at me. I watched the rapid internal reorientation of a person who has just discovered that the other party had a plan too, and that the plan was further along than anything she had prepared for. Then she shifted back toward the warm register, back toward the voice she had used for 10 years, the recovery mechanism deployed on pure reflex. I held up one hand, not aggressively, simply with finality, and told her to get a good lawyer. I took my jacket from the hook by the front door. I did not slam the door behind me. I sat in the driveway in my truck for 30 seconds, not reconsidering anything, simply giving myself the space to feel what was actually in front of me. A decade was over. Whatever it had been and hadn't been, it had been 10 years of my life, and the loss was real, even though the marriage had been built on something false. I allowed myself that 30 seconds. Then I started the engine and drove to Roy Hendricks's house, where Dorothy set biscuits in front of me without asking any questions, and Roy poured bourbon without asking any questions. And we watched a baseball game together, and somewhere in the 7th inning, I felt the last physical weight of that marriage lift from my shoulders, like something I had been carrying for so long I had stopped registering it as a load. The divorce took 7 months, which is fast for a case with that level of contested assets. Diane retained a competent downtown attorney who challenged the classification of the Millbrook Commons land as a business asset, pushed for a larger share of the house proceeds, and argued the dissipation figures with some persistence. At the third mediation session, with both parties present, Bill Garrett placed the documentation on the table. The notebook with its penciled calculations from the spring of 2017, the SunTrust account records, the carrier records with the annotated call patterns, Mick Torvalds' report and photographs, and the message records, because Diane had used our home Wi-Fi to back up her phone to a cloud account registered under her maiden name, a digital habit she had apparently set years before and never revisited as an exposure risk. Those messages contained detailed descriptions of our financial picture sent to a man who was not her husband, a personal timeline she had been maintaining, and at least one reference, in a message dated February of 2019, to what would happen when things were finally over. After a recess, the settlement conversation that followed was substantially different in tone from the one that had opened the session. The final number was $180,000, the Cadillac Escalade, her personal possessions, and the balance of the joint savings account, which by then had been drawn down to approximately $58,000. The withdrawals themselves forming an additional layer of dissipation documentation that opposing counsel had apparently decided not to contest. For Callaway Development LLC, for 63 acres of Henry County land and everything being built on it, for 14 acres of Barrier Island land, recorded under GPS coordinates in the name of a company whose books had been kept clean for 30 years. She received nothing.